Hello, all, and welcome to episode 54 of the Strength Ratio podcast. I'm your host, as always, Zach Greenwald, joined by Kyle Kochenko. And today, our guest is Evan Peikon from Training Think Tank. In fact, not far down the road from where we are in North Carolina. Evan's calling in from Atlanta. I do believe it's just outside of Atlanta, right, Evan? Not too far.
Yeah.
And it turns out most of our guests have actually been to Asheville. It's a funny connection, whether it's people at Training Think Tank not being far away, or people from Renaissance Periodization having all kind of formed and went to school.
Or Chapel Hill.
Or at Chapel Hill. There's like this little hub of things going on around the Carolinas, which is awesome. But we've spoken many times on the podcast, Evan, about concurrent training and its evolution. So, early models of concurrent training said not to have been at all effective simply because of the actual testing procedures itself, right? Take a bodybuilding program, layer it on top of a marathon program, put those together, they certainly don't work. But as we've improved, and while it's still a pretty novel field to research, one of concurrent training that is, we are understanding more about it. That said, there's been very little, if not anything, published about CrossFit in the context, I would say, or to the level of depth that you have explored and that you've taken interest in, with trying to discover the best ways perhaps to improve limitations to aerobic capacities or just, we would say, like all of what falls under cardiovascular challenges within the realm of CrossFit and its potential limitations. So might you maybe talk about when you first started CrossFit, because I believe I've heard you on another show say that you started CrossFit when you were like 19 years old, so it's been some time, what that looked like then, and now after receiving an education and having so much practical experience of your own, what this landscape kind of looks like now and how it's evolved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I started getting involved with CrossFit, I think now it's been maybe 7 or 8 years ago. So at the time, I'd come from a track and field background, so I was very much trying to approach the sport with that mindset. I was almost treating CrossFit like a decathlon in some ways. So the training models that I was trying to use, like you said, were trying to take track and field-based programming and then sandwich it with some form of strength programming, and inevitably it wouldn't really work all that well. Over time, I was playing with different methods of doing that, and I started to get to the point where things were clicking a little bit, but nothing really seemed to work all that well. And then the big breakthrough for me was about 4 or 5 years ago when I started getting into some of the years technology, and I was starting to collapse some of those like artificial boundaries between strength training and energy system training, and helping me see that they're actually all like different expressions of the same physiological systems. So through that lens, you could see how they're interrelated with one another and how they impact each other inside the body. And many of these things you're directly measuring them with NIRS technology, which is near infrared spectroscopy, things like the Moxie monitor, now things like the Humon are coming to market. And since then, that's very much influenced how I approach concurrent training and how I would phase or periodize training and address athletes' limitations.
Now, can you speak a bit about those particular tests? I know that most often testing done with concurrent training in the past, obviously, in say like a laboratory setting, would be done with a full metabolic cart to try to really provide some statistical analysis as to the power of whether or not something was a limiter or something was statistically significant. So can you tell us more about Moxie and what else in terms of this kind of not self-applied, but self-monitored testing, not in a non-laboratory setting, has helped you, and just more about it in and of itself?
Yeah, so I think the nature of the technology in and of itself makes it so it would be really difficult to study in a laboratory setting. So using the Moxie monitor, really the two variables that you're measuring, one is going to be the density of hemoglobin and myoglobin in the muscle tissue, and that's going to be your proxy for blood volume changes. And then the other thing that you're measuring is what's called SMO2, that's muscle oxygen saturation. The issue with trying to apply these things broadly and researching them is that SMO2 is a relative value. So all three of us could have 50% oxygen saturation, but in theory, we could have wildly different amounts of oxygenated hemoglobin in our blood. So when we're using this technology, it's really all intra-individual specific. So we're looking at the relationships between trends when we're doing different tests. So to give you an example of what this might look like, are you guys familiar with, I know it was big in the CrossFit community for a period, like the classic NME test where you take 85% of your back squat and you rep it out for max reps?
Yeah, at the time, it's been a little while, but yeah, I do remember when that was coming out.
Yeah, so that was like a big thing like 5 years ago. Everyone was using that, and you still see it quite a bit. And when people do that test, they would say if you get 1 or 2 reps, your high neuromuscular efficiency, you get 10, 15, 20 reps, your low neuromuscular efficiency. And it kind of made sense at the time. You'd think, oh, if you could rep out high percentages of your max back squat, like you have to be low neuromuscular efficiency. And everyone just kind of took that at face value. Using Near's technology, you pop a monitor on the muscle and you have an athlete do that test. And what you see is if an athlete gets 1 or 2 reps on it, it's generally because they're cutting off blood flow to the artery. If you think of the muscle almost like a hose, an arterial occlusion is you grab both ends of the hose so blood can't get in or out of the muscle. There's no blood flow, then there's no oxygen getting into the muscle. And once oxygen stalls out, you can't do anything. Similarly, you see the athletes that get 15, 20 reps, whatever on this, and you see they have steady blood flow and oxygen through the test. So is it really a test of neuromuscular efficiency, or is it just a test of the strength of cardiac output relative to muscle tension? Mm-hmm. Probably the latter. Through this lens, you start to see that strength training is energy system training, and then vice versa. So it kind of, we look at exercises and we create these false dichotomies, like, oh, I'm doing I don't know, like a 500-meter row, and let's say you're at 50 strokes per minute, so maybe you do like 60 strokes. Why is that different than doing 60 back squats at 95 pounds with the same velocity? You look at the trends in the muscle, they end up looking pretty similar. So when you view concurrent training, you understand these things, you can see that all of the training modalities are just one thing, and it makes it a little bit easier from a conceptual standpoint to phase these different training protocols and exercises and all these things.
Now, I'm sure some of this will come back up later on when we talk more about bioenergetics, because I know you use a lot of these things to define or assess your the limitations. I don't know. I was going to ask the periodization question. Do you feel like that's okay to go into, or did you have something else you were kind of leading?
Yeah. So if you can maybe flesh out, Evan, perhaps other confounding variables. So we're saying that physiologically, the systems. Sorry, that was the dog. Hopefully, that's all you'll get is just like a burp, and not like a crazy bark fit. He's asleep now. Is that we're seeing this continuum of endurance, at least physiologically endurance, and how you would perform, say, working sets of any rep range relative to, say, that 1 rep maximal as being correlative. How might this testing procedures, or how do you guys at Training Think Tank take into consideration perhaps certain things that might affect strength but not quite endurance? The first thing I can think about might be like gender differences, such as like abilities with relative abilities underneath a max effort. I don't know. Are there other? The gender is the first thing that came to my mind. And so for the viewers just listening, women are going to be able to perform more volume underneath their max than would men for
on average.
On average, for a few reasons. I'm wondering, Evan, if you can speak to that, or perhaps others, and how this is considered for your athletes.
Yeah. So. I don't know if I'd necessarily be speaking for everyone at Training Think Tank when I say this, because we all have slightly conflicting views on some things and we generally overlap on the majority. But the way that I generally see it, putting males through testing, females through testing, is I see less of a clear pattern with male versus female as the athlete's physiological limitations. So I generally find that males that would be delivery limited end up responding to most types of training inputs is females that are delivery limited. Males that are respiratory limited generally perform similar to females that are respiratory limited. So when you had mentioned being able to perform higher repetitions relative to an athlete's 1 rep max, is more of like a female characteristic. I do definitely see that as like an absolute data trend. More females could absolutely do that. But I also see that female athletes are generally less predisposed to being delivery limited athletes. So it would be hard to say like chicken or the egg, like does sex shift you towards one limit or the other, or is it like sport backgrounds that could predispose that? Because the way a lot of male athletes will become delivery limited athletes is by doing a lot of strength and power training, developing these peripheral systems and not developing the hard and essential systems, which predisposes them to being delivery limited. So that is to say that I see the patterns, but I just don't know if it's inherent or if it happens due to like environmental factors.
Now, maybe we can just, for the audience, Evan, explain the different systems, and when you're saying there's a limitation, maybe we can explain like how, in a practical way, people can conceptualize of this and how they might understand how to identify or even just at least conceptualize of this limitation in themselves.
Yeah, of course. So when I think of like a limiting system, obviously when you're doing any form of all-out exercise, there are thousands of different physiological processes that are happening simultaneously. But the reality is only a small handful of them are going to end up being like a rate limiting step. So the way that I like to analogize this is, let's pretend we have a car factory and our goal is to get as many cars out the door as possible. Let's say it's like Hot Wheels. There's only 3 steps in this. You can either put the wheels on the car, put the doors on, or put the steering wheel on. Putting the steering wheel on the car is the slowest step. So if we want to get more cars out the door of our factory, we're not going to speed up the rate of putting tires on or put more people in the crew putting the doors on quicker, because then you'll just have a big surplus and you still need to put those steering wheels on faster. The same thing happens with exercise. We have this small handful of rate limiting systems, and one of them is going to lag behind the other. So in practical terms, these are generally, one could be the respiratory system. So an ideal scenario, it functions to get enough O2 into the body and enough CO2 out of the body. Another one could be the cardiac system, or just generally called delivery limitation, which is you are limited in your ability to supply blood and O2 to the working muscle where it's used for energy production, which curtails into the next limitation, which I would call muscular utilization limitation. You have enough oxygen in the muscle, but you cannot utilize it at a quick enough rate. Or there's a neurological limitation, which could be some combination of fiber recruitment, power output, things like that. So with any of these limitations, a given athlete can manifest different ones on different tests, but they're going to have some form of systemic limitation, and this is going to influence how they adapt to training, and you're going to see compensation patterns that unfold around it. So to kind of make this practical, let's say in CrossFit, when we see delivery limited athletes in CrossFit, they have very predictable patterns of compensation. The reason that this happens, if you have, with a delivery limited athlete, one of their biggest problems is that their muscular tension is too high relative to what their heart could pump against. So anytime you create a blockage in the muscle, which would be like a compression reaction or venous occlusion or arterial occlusion, when that occurs, the heart's going to be driven to push through that no matter what. When the heart can't do that, you're going to get a low O2 environment in the muscle. So you often see with a delivery limited athlete, they might be getting venous occlusion reactions. Generally in the literature, you see that happening somewhere between like 30 and 70% of an athlete's voluntary contraction. They could get it with as little as like 10 to 15. So they're doing CrossFit workouts, wall balls and thrusters and these higher activity activities. They're not getting steady blood oxygen in the tissues, and they're getting a lot of occlusion, and this is causing them to hypertrophy, get more systemic tension. So you see a lot of these CrossFit athletes that don't really do much strength work, or they do very little hypertrophy work, and they put on significant amounts of muscle just from doing CrossFit. That's a compensation pattern of being a delivery limited athlete. So when I'm talking about the limitations, I'm both talking about what stifles an athlete in a specific workout, but also what predictable patterns of compensation unfold as a product of them just doing training.
Do you mind if I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, it seems we've gone into the bioenergetics, so we might as well keep going. Yeah, it's okay.
I get excited, and then he gives me a look like, bro, you just totally messed up how we're doing this. So, and at least how I recall these limitations, at least as observed in academia and in exercise education that I received, the one that stands out as one that wasn't really spoken about would be the respiratory limitations.
Yep.
And I was just curious because, I think as perhaps like brought to the public eye, there was talk about like breathing and how that can perhaps play a role in performance, and perhaps there were certain ways that you can breatd to improve performance.
There's a lot of debate over whether this is legit or not.
Yeah, so people might remember like Wim Hof, and we know that we have friends who work with the Art of Breath seminar, something that Brian McKenzie started. So one thing I just want to ask is, where are you guys looking to for respiratory limitations and its, I guess, credibility and kind of this bringing together of this information to inform where an athlete could be limited, and how would they go about identifying, or how would you go about identifying that respiratory limitation?
Yeah, so to give context, there would be a few different types of respiratory limitations that would manifest for different reasons. So the ones related to CO2 balance, breath position, that would be one. And then related to performance, what we generally see, because you're right, like I've taken XBiz courses also, and they never really talk about the respiratory system being performance limiting. It's just always kind of glossed over. But then using technology like NIRS, you start to see what's called a respiratory metaboreflex very often with high-level endurance athletes. So the way that this generally manifests is you have an athlete with really good cardiac output and they have really good mitochondrial and capillary density, but where they're limited is having a weak respiratory system. So I'm not going to get this exact percentage right. I think it's upwards of 27% of total energy expenditure during all endurance exercise is spent on just the diaphragm muscle alone. So generally the way that you see this happening in live time is when the diaphragm starts to fatigue. It's like, obviously it's contracting many times per minute. If you're doing like a 10-minute assault like for max cals, you might be at 40 breaths per minute. That's 400 muscular contractions of varying intensities based on your depth of breath and your how much CO2 you're exhaling. So the way that you'll see this on a NIRS device is you see progressively decreasing SMO2 levels, which would be the amount of oxygen in the muscle. And then you see a lower ability to reload oxygen into the blood. Simultaneously, you'll see increased blood volume, and that's going to be due to vasodilation, because before when I'd mentioned the functions of the respiratory system are both to get O2 in, hence having lower O2 in the muscle when the muscle's coming to fatigue. It's also to get carbon dioxide out. So when CO2 is building up inside the body, you get a systemic vasodilation, and then that's going to open up the capillaries. Once you push this far enough, the brain, the central governor, is going to kick in. So as a defense mechanism, so the diaphragm doesn't come to fatigue. It's like if your biceps, you push into failure, oh, congrats, you can't pick up your arms. If your diaphragm fatigues, you're going to die within a few minutes. So athletes get what's called a respiratory metaboreflex, which is a shunting of blood towards the respiratory musculature, and then a progressive decrease in blood flow to the extremity muscles. On a NIRS device, you'll see they'll arterial occlude the arms and legs, and then once they cut off blood to the artery, they have to stop, because you don't have O2 in the muscle, and if you have O2, you can't do anything. So that's where it comes to the performance. But then when we're talking about breathing and things of that nature, this is where I'm a little bit more conflicted, particularly with these Wim Hof style breathing protocols. It's not that I don't think they're effective, but I think it's more so that they are highly effective for some people and the worst thing that other athletes could do. So it's not like a panacea. And to kind of explain why this works, there's something like a Wim Hof breathing protocol, or generally hypoxic breathing protocols. What they're sold as doing is improving an athlete's CO2 tolerance. An athlete's a long end endurance athlete, or just like a general person that doesn't do a ton of high intensity or like anaerobic-esque exercise, they usually have pretty low CO2 tolerance, and improving this is going to be a really great adaptation for them. But the issue is when you're using these protocols with CrossFit athletes already have high CO2 tolerance because they're doing a ton of training that improves that. Mm-hmm. So CO2 is, this is a really weird comparison to use, but I think it's effective. So have you ever heard the term chasing the dragon? Like if you use an opioid or other drugs, you always need to use more to get the same effect as the first time you use the drug.
not from personal opioid use, but I have
Yeah,
heard
yeah, me too. Just the term. And the reason that this happens, you take a pharmacology course, they talk about decreased receptor binding sites. So part of getting less effect from a drug is that you literally have less receptors to detect it. So when an athlete is chronically exposed to high CO2 levels, which could become the case when you have a CrossFit athlete or someone that's very CO2 tolerant, and then they're doing a lot of Wim Hof breathing protocols or hypoxic breathing protocols, they become overly sensitized or overly tolerant of CO2. So where this becomes problematic is when you're doing very high intensity exercise, you have two different drives to respire and start hyperventilating. The primary one is the carbonic drive. So when an athlete's CO2 is building up, it should trigger the carbonic drive, which senses CO2, and then that should tell an athlete, start breathing fast and blow off that CO2. When an athlete is overly CO2 tolerant, they lose function of their carbonic drive and they rely on what's called the hypoxic drive. So they don't start hyperventilating until their brain is losing O2. So this is what we see in those respiratory limited athletes that I just talked about, where they get that buildup of CO2 in the muscle and then they systemically vasodilate. This is often because they don't know to start breathing heavy because they've created dysfunction in that carbonic drive. As a result, one of the things you see when we put these athletes through testing is they get decreased SpO2 or hypoxemia. So if you put a pulse oximeter on them, you'll see they desaturate peripherally and their brain doesn't get enough O2. And then when you talk to them, they often talk about, oh, my fingers and my toes were tingling after this 500-meter row, or my lips were going numb, or my vision was tunneling out. So that's why I'm hesitant to kind of recommend breathing protocols as a blanket statement. It's just very contextual, in my opinion.
And for these limitations, is it also, I don't know if this is something you could say like on average or you have enough data on, but like speaking of respiratory, it sounds like something that would really only affect like maybe high level athletes, but like the majority of people should focus more on delivery or utilization. Then that's going to be like, I don't know, just random term, like 95% of your return. And then this could be like the extra high level, or is this something that like throughout all phases of training, you could incorporate? Because I find at times that when there's new, well, to me, these are somewhat new terms in the last year for endurance training, I would say, that people tend to want to focus on that like 1%, when really they just need to be doing like harder training to get better, but they think that it's this like tiny thing that's limiting them.
Yeah, so the way that I kind of think about it is with these limitations, every athlete's going to have a limitation. And whether or not you really want to focus on it that much depends on what level they're at. Similar with like, you guys obviously strength ratio, you're involved in strength sports, but male comes in and he's back squatting 135 and his hamstrings are the weak link, or you could be like, we just really need to train his hamstrings a ton. It's like, no, dude, just go squat a few times. Yeah. You'll squat more. Similar with this, like if I have a CrossFit athlete and they've been doing it for 5 months and they're at a very low level and they want to get testing done, I'll just tell them, I'm like, I really don't care what your physiological limitation is, because you just need to get better at everything. And your ceiling for getting better at everything is so low that no matter what you do, your limiter is going to improve. Where this becomes more relevant is when athletes get to the intermediate to advanced stages and they have to start specializing in more things, particularly in a sport like CrossFit, where if an athlete has 50 different training qualities that they need to improve, you find athletes often do so much training volume that it's ridiculous. And the reality is maybe 50% of it is actually effective for what their limiter is. So by addressing these rate limiting steps, you could be a little bit more surgical in training and you could cut their volume down significantly. So then that way, when they inevitably do plateau, you always have the fallback of adding a little bit volume to drive adaptation or keeping them healthy for longer periods, so they could train with higher intensities year round and not run into the common issues that people always talk about, like CrossFit athletes are always injured or they always have adrenal issues. It's like, well, that is true when you're just smashing your head against the wall every single day of the week.
So if you
Can I actually ask one more question real quick? Yeah. So kind of off of that, I guess, I don't know how to frame this actually. I say these, so utilization, respiratory, and delivery. I think sometimes it helps to kind of talk about like how things have progressed to this point. So like, for a long time it was like, oh, drive up Dexter, drive up VO2 max. And then it was, okay, what's the percent of VO2 max that you can hold? Because that's very important. And running economy or economy movement and all those things. And kind of like talking about where endurance has like come from to maybe where energy system training has like started to like how this is different or changed. Does that make sense what I'm trying to get at?
I think so. So is it asking like what is the need for this change?
Yeah. So like, I guess it would be, I think a lot of this comes from, because there is so much nomenclature out there. Sometimes it finds to help like how this is different than like VO2 max training or like interval training. Like how would this look differently, potentially like also like in a practice?
Or is anything synonymous with?
Or if anything, exactly.
Yeah. So the way that I think about this, you could compare it to VO2 max or anaerobic threshold testing. Those tell you more of like what the absolute like measurement is, but they don't necessarily tell you why. So to give you an idea, if the three of us did an anaerobic threshold test, let's say we all got the exact same score, it wouldn't really be that prescriptive, because it's like, well, why did we all get this score? The reason could be different for all of us. So the reason that the anaerobic threshold or the lactate balance point is generated in the first place is when an athlete's limiter gives out. So once you push above threshold, the limiter can't handle that load. And then you start to default to different compensation patterns to keep yourself going. So by testing for the limiter and figuring this out, we could kind of just skip VO2 max testing or threshold testing entirely, because if you improve your limiter, you're going to improve those other measurements. But if you artificially improve those other measurements, it doesn't always make you a better athlete. You could improve your anaerobic threshold just by training at threshold, and that's an artificial increase there. And when you see that in the research, athletes don't have performance benefits that correspond with it, where when you improve the limiter directly, threshold increases, but you also see corresponding performance improvements.
So you're gauging the improvements of the thresholds with the technology that you have available. So it's
improvement of limiters, is that what you meant to say, or of thresholds?
Sorry, the technology helps you discern that the limitations are being improved upon, correct?
Yeah.
And it's something that you're using on site with athletes who are either coming to you or athletes who are part of the gym, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Correct, yeah.
So we work with CrossFit athletes from a distance as well, and not all of them, given there's so many benefits of remote coaching. Unfortunately, one of them is you sometimes just wish you had them like right there. And that's not always the case, especially if they don't live in this country or they live quite far away. Is that if you're approaching like this kind of mindset of these improving these limitations, if this athlete's at a distance, do you have a certain way of trying to improve upon all of these potential limitations differently with different styles of exercise, if this makes sense? How would this perhaps be considered when writing a program for someone who you don't quite have your hands on?
Yeah, so what I generally try and do, because as reference, most of my athletes are remote. I coach a lot of countries I coach a lot of countries overseas. Now I just run nations. Now I have a lot of athletes overseas, and a lot of my other athletes are scattered throughout the U.S. So I actually get to put them through testing a very small amount. So what I do is, knowing that a lot of these limiters come with predictable compensation patterns that unfold around them, I'll give athletes proxy field tests. So I might give an athlete like a speed preservation profile, where if, say, they're experienced on a rower, I might get their 1K, 2K, 3K, and 5K PRs, and then compare like the ratio of 2K speed, 5K speed, 3K to 1K, and then graph them out and get a speed preservation curve for the athlete. And knowing how those curves would line up to a theoretical delivery, respiratory, or utilization limited athlete, that will give me data. And then also knowing how these athletes generally adapt to training, knowing that those delivery limited athletes are usually restricted by their ability to get blood into the working muscle. you would know that if they are doing strength training within this certain percent range, this is generally how many reps they'll get. So a lot of the findings or kind of takeaways or things that a lot of coaches come to naturally. You might find one of your athletes who's very enduring and kind of a hard gainer. They need like a ridiculous set volume of strength exercises to make improvements. And you might find that an athlete who has like exceptional adaptation to strength volume, they could squat like once a month and maintain a 500-pound back squat doing CrossFit. There are these things that you find just by working with them and kind of being open-minded to protocols that might not really make that much sense based on traditional training structures. And I find that using these proxies and talking to the athletes, engage in them, you could kind of shortcut some of that period. If I do some testing and talk to the athlete and I think they're delivery limited, I'll usually start with some general protocols that I would write for delivery limited athletes. So I might give them like ramping row intervals that are auto-regulated. And I would think if an athlete is delivery limited, they'll get capped out on this pretty quickly. If they're respiratory, they could probably do these intervals indefinitely because the cardiac system won't come to a point of failure. Then I'll give the athletes a lot of auto-regulated training. I'll see where they end up falling with their set numbers and their reps. And then that will give me generally a big enough data set that I could more or less infer what their limitation is.
Gotcha. So the auto-regulation would be around the weight training aspects of it, or both weight training. We use two different scales of auto-regulation. One with reps in reserve for resistance training exercises, and another scale that we have taken from Complete Human Performance. That's Alex Viada's company. I don't know if you're familiar with them. He has a heart rate category. There's also just the there's a respiratory category. I think there's even like general activity, like RP1 says lawn bowling. RP9 is like 4-letter expletives. So how do you use auto-regulation as you're describing it here?
Yeah, so some of them I have certain workouts that I'll give people. So one, and I can explain what this would look like on an ears device and why we would do this. So let's say you have a utilization limited athlete, and you know one of the things they need to do to improve is increase mitochondrial biogenesis or get more mitochondria in the muscle. An effective way to do this is through repeated sprint training. So what we can do is, let's say you're my athlete, I give you a workout, we have a 45-minute running clock, do a 10-second assault bike at 75% of your max wattage with 1 minute rest in between. And then I'll give them a bunch of subjective parameters that once you can't elicit within this percentage of your power output, heart rate doesn't come to baseline within these parameters during your 1 minute rest period, you start to compensate biomechanically, or you get these specific fatigue sensations. Up the workout there and just spin at a low intensity for the remainder of the workout. So it's a mixture of some objective markers and subjective. And the reason that we pick those markers for the different protocols that we do is we have enough data of just popping devices on athletes and having them do those workouts in live time and seeing the trends on the device. You could ask them, okay, how do you feel right now? Oh, you feel this way when oxygen and blood are doing this. You feel this way when they're doing that. And once you get enough data with different athletes, issue is obviously from a like pure academic standpoint, this isn't perfectly research backed. There is some subjective perception in this. And that's why we do try and just stay open-minded to being willing to change these intervals or use athlete like perception and really just seeing how their performance improves over time. In doing this, I've definitely adjusted the way that I make these protocols over the past 3 years, and I found that they just generally work better than the things I was doing before. So I'd like to think that things are going in the right direction, but then again, all my athletes could just be doing progressively increasing amounts of drugs without telling me, and be the reason too. So
You have a. I just have a.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So, when we're looking at a CrossFitter and they have these energetic limitations, we then invite all of the highly skill-specific aspects of the sport that is CrossFit. How do you? Sometimes for our athletes who compete on a higher level or have higher aspirations, I mean, that needs analysis becomes potentially so long.
Mm-hmm.
And you just sometimes want to like hit your head against the wall because there's so much that comes together and talk about like potential interference effects. At this point in time, I look at CrossFitters who compete at a high level, and it's like, it just doesn't matter. They still get the job done. And in trying to help people achieve that next level of CrossFit performance, how are you able to program for as many people as you do as individuals, while considering how varied these needs analysis can be when we throw the energetics and the specific skills and all of how they can, just pair together and
just lead into my question.
Distract from one another. Just would love to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah, so a lot of what I do is just trying to boil things down to least common denominators. So oftentimes with different movements, like this isn't always the case, but you might see, oh, an athlete is awful at cycling shoulder to overhead and cycling power snatches and cycling handstand push-ups. Movement patterns and muscles used, not exactly the same, but you might realize like, oh, this athlete has absolute dog shit thoracic, or is stuck in thoracic extension. They have like shit thoracic mobility. It's like, oh, well, maybe we don't actually need to like hammer all those movement patterns. Maybe just clean up their thoracic and pelvic positions and teach them to breathe with their arms overhead. And you find that it addresses all of these limitations. So a lot of it is just finding why an athlete can't do the thing that they do well. Sometimes it really is a muscular endurance limitation. If an athlete has too many of those, you do need to be careful with where you're spending your volume. But I think that's also where we get into like different schemes of phasing and periodizing training. One of the things that I found is through a lot of like traditional periodization, I can't even pronounce the word, periodization. Could put subtitles up on the screen. So a lot of athletes do is they spend time building up these big bases in one area, and then they move on to other things, and they move on to other things. And I think that could work well in a lot of sports, but the issue is in CrossFit, when you have so many training qualities, people end up building something up and moving on, and then they just let those other things degrade. So I find a better way to do things is to go through processes of building and maintaining. So I like to keep some semblance of touches on all training qualities for athletes at all times of the year, and I'll just vary up the frequency and total volume contribution of each of them. So we'll be prioritizing something, and when we want to prioritize something else, we don't throw that thing away and jettison it out into the ether and lose those adaptations. We keep it at enough volume to maintain it. It might take a lot of volume to develop a quality, but it doesn't really take that much work to maintain something. So I think if you could be a little bit more analytical and keep track of what you're trying to build and what you're trying to maintain, and then what things impact each other, it actually boils it down quite a bit. So there's a lot less to think about. I think something else that does help is looking at the sport through like an analytical lens. Look at every sanctional event and open event and regional and games event, and you find that with any given movement, you could see the different loading profiles that they could use, and then you could see what rep ranges an athlete would have to handle that loading in. So you might see with 95-pound thrusters, an athlete will generally have to be able to do 100 within this window of time based on events. If thrusters are 185 pounds, this is the most reps we've seen in an event. So if you could train athletes to handle those volumes in certain time periods, whether you're progressing into that through EMOMs, broken intervals, or things like that, you could kind of segment things in like more of a limiter-based training phase. And then in order to maintain them, you could just cut those volumes down quite a bit and just put them into Metcons and other training structures, and athletes don't lose their ability to handle it.
Mm-hmm. So this, we just had Brett Contreras on the show, and we were talking with him about how easy it is to maintain certain strength characteristics. We didn't really tap into how easy it is for one to maintain certain cardiovascular characteristics. Might you just talk on that? Because I do know, at least in myself and in my other athletes, and as we have this emphasis, de-emphasis, I think we're just using different words, like, not peak versus maintenance, but we're not pushing everything to the same intensity always. Is how do you find with these different limitations you're able to as easily maintain them as you would, say, strength characteristics? Are they similar if you take this philosophy that physiologically they're quite similar?
Yes, I think it depends on what the limitation is, because if an athlete is utilization limited, for example, I look at it more of what physiological constructs contribute to a training quality. So if we look at a utilization limitation, mitochondrial density is going to be like the sole thing that really influences that. That's an adaptation that's fairly easy to lose, but fairly easy to build back as well. So if an athlete doesn't do anything to retain mitochondrial density, which would basically be they just stop training for a month, they'll lose significant ground. But to maintain that, you don't really need to do all that much once you build it. So it really depends on the quality. For a delivery limited athlete, it's similar. Like if you do a lot of easy aerobic work and you get those eccentric cardiac adaptations, albeit potentially minimal based on some of the newer research, you could go upwards of like 60 to 90 days without really doing any work for that before you start significantly losing adaptation. But then when you look at the respiratory system, that's the one that's kind of the most fickle. Once you go over about 10 days with doing zero work close to VO2, you start to lose about 7% of top end performance for each subsequent 7 to 10 days. That one's a very quick rate of detraining. So I think for working with a CrossFit athlete, and this is, I find it especially prudent leading into a competition when you want to peak and taper, is looking at each training quality and seeing how long they take to degrade, and then peaking and tapering different training qualities at different rates. So everything is like pseudo fresh on game day. And I think the same just goes for intentionally not training qualities. So you could figure out like what the least amount you have to do to maintain them is.
This is kind of a maybe not different, but hopefully this doesn't take us off track. But it would seem that you mentioned earlier that like some people might be able to squat like once a month and maintain everything.
Yep.
And then talking about like emphasis and how things can change in that such is like, do you ever have to have like a talk with athletes around like the training like if I only had to squat once a month, I'd be like, what the hell? That's not going to work. Like you're crazy. Around like, hey, like I know this seems really unconventional or different, that like you're not squatting once a week, but it's every other week. Is that ever like a hard conversation to have, that like the training potentially looks so much different because you're trying to convey that like, look, you really only have to do this much and you will still progress?
Yeah, so less with specific exercises, more with total training volume. So a lot of times, this is kind of the approach that I use. A lot of times I'll have like, I guess regionals isn't the thing anymore, but would have previously been like bubble level regional athletes. They'll come in and I'll look at their training volume, and it is like
insane.
Absurd how much they're doing. Like they're taking Travis Mayer's training volume and Noah Olson's and sandwiching it together and doing this like crazy thing. And I'll always be like, okay, we need to cut this back. And athletes are always hesitant. So the sell that I usually use for athletes is, let me program the amount of volume and the frequency that I think is appropriate for 8 weeks. And if you don't get better, I'll program whatever you want for the next 8 months. Like you could just tell me any crazy shit and I'll just write it for you. And inevitably you do what you think is right. And most of the time it ends up working, and that gets the buy-in. Unfortunately, there are those like scenarios where you're wrong. You just need to be like, I just made a miscalculation. Like,
yeah, that's fine. That would be, that's fine. And this is popped in my head because you mentioned them, and of course you work with a lot of higher level athletes. Do you have any, like on average, like how many hours per week, like athletes are training? Because, like in endurance sports, it could be like 20 to 30 hours. And then in strength sports, maybe more like 8 to 14 type things. What would you say on average people usually training, and like maybe like what volumes and frequencies of things usually look like?
Oh man, that'd be tough to say. I think hours is difficult with CrossFitters just because there's so much like dicking around between training pieces. So someone might tell you they're in the gym for like 2.5 hours. And should have taken you like 60 minutes.
Yeah.
And then in terms of session frequency, I have some athletes that might train 2 or 3 times a day, but all those sessions added up might not be that much bigger than one athlete's single session. So it's just like a super broad number. I have athletes train anywhere from 4 sessions up to like 10 to 12 sessions per week, but I'd say the average intermediate to advanced CrossFit athlete probably trains like 5 to 8 times a week that I coach.
Gotcha.
Which might seem a lot less than people think, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually generally their training volume isn't that bad. Like, I have 2 athletes at the games this year, and I plan on writing some kind of write-up of their training for the past year after the fact, and their volumes really aren't that impressive. Like, you'd look at them and you'd be like, oh, it's really not that much work.
Mm-hmm. And I think if you're listening and you're wondering, am I doing too much? And quite often we'll find with CrossFitters that just doing more Metcon might not address these limitations where you need it, especially if you're not getting that feedback from a coach. Is that if you are hurting your performance, because it is possible there are higher caps to volume to which you will start to get worse. That is your first telltale sign. You just go ahead and maybe like more than half the volume. I would say also that if you are just plateaued and something's not working, you could even just try to do a little bit of removal, just take away a little bit. And like we're saying, though it might be hard for your psyche, and because you do love to train, doing less might lead to better gains. And I do have a question for you, and I know our athletes might be listening to this and wondering, you mentioned like if a limitation, because when you consider all of this, could be position-based. Their ability to express their joint range of motion as they would need to perform the task to either competition standards or to improve certain efficiencies. So I'm just wondering, you use the term mobility, how you guys are working with athletes to discuss this topic of mobility, what's influenced you all, or at least you, with how to improve someone's, position-specific improvements and capabilities. At least what we do is we look to just find the movement that they're in and just make sure that we have a graded exposure with positions that they can maintain. We don't often, unless the athlete really feels like it's to their benefit, prescribe specific mobility work. We'll prescribe certain joint ranges of motion and exercises that are like outside of the sagittal plane that CrossFit's commonly performed in, just so that they don't get locked into repetitive involvement of muscles in only certain types of contractions and planes of motion. So before our athletes call us out, I'm not giving them mobility drills. I'd love to hear just what you mean by mobility and how you guys are looking to improve that in an athlete.
Yes, I think I'm probably more similarly minded to you. I guess mobility is kind of a bad word choice on my part. I don't really give athletes like mobility training either. Like, I'm not giving people like banded distractions or like go like roll around on whatever for minutes a day. So more specifically, what I would do, I would look at it through a few different ways. So like one kind of reductionist example, could people see me right now if I like do something?
Yeah.
Okay, so to give you an example.
The people watching can.
Yeah, could just everyone see me in this general?
Evan's putting his arms over his head.
Yeah, so if I put my arm over my head and I come into like full end range here. So let's say that's generally the end range of motion on the chest to bar pull-up. You see some athletes, you tell them to do that, like keep your ribs tucked, don't let them flare, and go like this, and the athlete could come up to here. So if that's the case, if an athlete is doing chest to bar pull-ups and they're loading a range that they don't actually possess, the only reason that they could get into that end range in a butterfly chest to bar is because they're using their body weight to pull them into that position. Whereas if they have that capability, so if I see major discrepancies like that, I will use things like end range lift-offs and like end range isometrics to get athletes into those positions. And then we might do pulses or strength exercises in those positions to kind of capture them over time. So they have just more longevity in sport. Like if an athlete can't get into a full, you see all the time, like an athlete, they can't get into a full squat and then they put like 315 on their back and they could get into a full squat. And it's like, well, you can't get there naturally. You're probably going to snap your shit up when you're doing a ton of squats in a workout and you're pushing yourself into these positions you can't tolerate. That's generally more So the lens that I would look at it at. And then the other thing would be more of like an energetic standpoint. So with CrossFitters specifically, you see a lot of them have poor thoracic or pelvic positions. Specifically, you see a lot of them are stuck in thoracic extension. So when athletes are in these extension patterns, the diaphragm can't vertically expand properly during respiration. So in order to create that vertical space for the diaphragm, the superficial neck muscles and sternocleidomastoid, they'll pull upwards on the clavicles. And you'll see these clavicles like a very like aggressive V shape, and this causes a lot of shoulder and neck injuries for respiratory limited athletes. So you see pretty significant performance improvements just by restoring their thoracic mobility, improving their pelvic position, or you see a lot of them have very like closed down infrasternal angles from being very like bound up in the midsection. So it's more things like that that directly influence energetics or are more for general health and longevity and the common contractions in the sport that I'm focusing on. But I'll very rarely just give athletes like mobility WOD type stuff or like give them like a ROM WOD workout or things like that.
Off of this, do you find that there's any mobility limitations that are actually beneficial to the sport? So like, world-class benchers, it actually helps to be like, tight in the chest because it's a functional adaptation. But is because CrossFit's so varied and crazy, you can't really have any of that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I think it's more about where the tension, because it's like your body's going to have tension no matter what. Like we're literally held together by length tension relationships. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a matter of that tension being in the right place. So I guess we're looking through the body as like a single unit of like regional interdependence. You see a lot of athletes have their tension in the wrong areas and they have their laxity in the wrong areas. So they'll be like tight in the thoracic and tight in the hips. And then they'll gain degrees of freedom through their lumbar spine and cause injuries where it's like, well, if you have tension there and tension through the core, then you could have mobility on these sides. I find generally because athletes have to do such high contractions in this sport, the ability to regulate their tension is really important. So you think of there's like an optimal length tension relationship for any activity that you're doing. If you're going to go run a 10K, the optimal tension in the muscle is pretty low. You're doing, I don't know, like thousands of low level contractions. But if you're going to go hit a max clean and jerk, you want your tension to be pretty damn high for that one powerful contraction. So I think one of the major causes of that like concurrent training effect you see is just people not regulating their tension properly. It's like, oh, they did a run training on Tuesday, and of course they're weaker on Wednesday because they've optimized their muscle tension for lower contractions. So I think for a CrossFitter, it's the ability to ramp that tension up and swing into a parasympathetic state, but then get back down into a lower tension baseline. Like you see with a lot of games athletes, they might look like jacked and like you'd think if you press into them, they'll have a lot of muscle tension, but they go on a training table and like you press into them and they have like zero muscle tension in their body. And that's great for doing metcons because you're getting very steady blood flow in all of the tissues. And because of that, you're getting a lot of oxygenation, where those tighter delivery limited athletes, they're cutting off blood flow left and right. While they might do great in a strength workout, when it comes to a mixed workout where they're alternating involved and non-involved muscle groups, that ends up increasing their intra-abdominal pressure too much and restricting their blood flow to the working muscles.
Awesome. I feel like I want this conversation to go like another, like twice as long. I have so many questions. Do you have anything? I have one thing that I want to kind of like dive into, but I want to make sure that we've covered everything that you have.
Psychological.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you meet at Battle Cat Coffee in Asheville, I could.
Yeah, it's down the road. Yeah, that place. Wait, just a quick story is that about Battle Cat.
Speaking of, I got my little Battle Cat here.
Yeah, he's been playing around in the back. It's fun. Yeah. So for those who don't know, Battle Cat Coffee we used to live like right down the road. It's this place in Asheville, and there's this hippie side of Asheville. It's West Asheville, and we form what's called the West Asheville Muscle Support Group. Mm-hmm. So if you have muscles and they're quite visible, there are some danger zones in West Asheville. Battle Cat is like probably the most dangerous place. Looks, you'll get nasty looks, and you need to go with more than one person in the muscle support group. I'm not projecting at all. And it's funny you mentioned bathrooms, but reeling this back in, I just want to make sure. Great coffee. I just want to make sure that Kyle has asked, because we want to be respectful of your time, his questions before I tap him.
Yeah, I think all of it came through. I know we were potentially gonna speak more on periodization, but I think you kind of got into that well enough with the emphasis, de-emphasis, and things like that. So I know Zach has been. He watched the video today, so he's been dying now.
Okay, well, so no, I think, and what I really like, Evan, is I've done more research on you, is that, so certainly, and for people listening, you're highly educated and you take great interest in your own secondary education, which sounds like it's largely like self-education, and that this is something that you're very well spoken in and very well versed in. At the same time, I've heard you talk about training psychology pertaining to things as simple as training / work-life balance. It's very present in how you choose to highlight your own life on social media. So how, in your mind, do you kind of approach this of having athletes who are going to the games and the complexities that are involved with those athletes in that program versus those who have high aspirations in the sport, but also perhaps just want to look and feel good because I'm going to try to sandwich a whole big thing together, which is the field of CrossFit's changed so dramatically, right? Like the separation is now just so big. Mm-hmm. And that regionals field being gone, at least for the athletes we've worked with, it's created a really interesting psychological challenge. The bridge that they once could cross is no longer there. The bridge is much wider. So have you found that you're having more talks about reshaping goals with the landscape of CrossFit? And if you can maybe just somehow answer this question succinctly, as I'm sure you'll be able to, how do you just involve the demands of the sport with what you perceive as just a healthy relationship with the sport?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think a lot of this balancing act with sport and life and all these things, to me, a lot of it just comes down to meaning. So I think for the top level athlete, this isn't really as much of a concern because they're making a living for this. This is legitimately a career for them. So they're not trying to balance CrossFit and their job and their social life. It's this is their job. They're just balancing work and life. But for these intermediate athletes, this is a very small part of their life. And over the past few years, first, a few years ago, when we had super regionals, that created this identity crisis for a lot of athletes that lost their chance to go to regionals. And you saw a lot of competitors stop doing CrossFit entirely. Then this new sanctional change, the same thing happened. And I think a lot of these psychological issues or more of these existential crises that athletes had could have been solved in the first place just by addressing what the purpose of the sport is to them. So I find a lot of people, their goal, they just want to be the best at something. And it's not that that's a bad goal. I mean, that's a great goal. Matt Frazier's making a killing. He's having a great life. A lot of competitors are. But the issue is when doing that isn't inherently meaningful to someone. So if someone just wants to be the best at something, it's well, pick a sport, go play fucking badminton or whatever is going to allow you to do that, because clearly you don't care about the self-fulfillment that you have. But most people that got into CrossFit or weightlifting or powerlifting, I see you're wearing a powerlifting shirt, you're not getting into powerlifting because you're trying to make fat stacks of cash. You probably started because you really enjoy lifting heavy weights. And I think the issue is when a lot of athletes start with that harmonious passion, and then it becomes a source of obsessive passion for them, where they start throwing away other values in their life to get better at that one thing and becoming very myopic with it. You find a lot of times athletes do this, and while their performance might improve and they have a lot more control over their training, they're actually less happy overall. So I think for athletes, a big thing is trying to find what is meaningful to you and why is this meaningful? Meaning is often just created in this self-perpetuating loop. Say we all train at the same CrossFit gym, and me doing better on Fran is meaningful because it's meaningful to you guys. It's meaningful to you guys because these CrossFitters down the block that it's meaningful to. And it's this big web that we all get tangled in. It's very easy to get lost in that because it's this prepackaged idea. you don't have to face ambiguity and deal with these things on your own because you're adopting this school of thought from someone else, and it's very easy to digest. But then inevitably athletes get to a point where they realize that that's meaningless. And they could take that in two ways. That could be very like de-empowering. You're like, oh fuck, all my training goals are meaningless. So like now I'm just gonna give up and not do anything. Or that could be very empowering. Oh, PRing my friend and being really good at chest to bars is meaningless. Well, then I don't have to do those. And I could take the things that I enjoy from CrossFit, take things that I enjoy from hypertrophy training and weightlifting and running. And because I'm not trying to be the best that I physically can at CrossFit, I could just reject the portions of it that I don't like. Like people, it feels like the fitness industry is very segmented, where if you're a CrossFitter, like you are a fucking CrossFitter. Like you can't admit that doing chest to bars for 200 reps might be stupid if your goal is also to put on muscle.
Yeah.
Like, no, it is. Like if you're trying to get a jacked upper body, you're not going to do the set volume that you need and like get that max adaptive volume while doing CrossFit full time. So instead, take the things that you like from all of them. What I tell my clients in this boat is like, we're not going to do CrossFit, or like we're not doing powerlifting, like whatever their name is, say it's Mike. It's like we're doing Mike Fit. Like we're just going to figure out the shit that you like, you enjoy pushing yourself and you enjoy getting better at, and we'll do that. And then in a few months, we'll see what you think about that, and then we'll just adjust it again. So doing this for like a year now since the games changed, I have these people doing like weird fitness combos where it's like, I boulder and I'm a rower. Like I do ultra marathons and I lift weights. And it's like, yeah, that's not a thing, but people enjoy it. And I think at the end of the day, unless you're making your career, like we all just want to have fun and like enjoy our training and our life.
Yeah, I think that if, and every community is guilty of this. We're just going to speak about perhaps CrossFit because that's what we've been talking about, is that like there's no guilt, and we just spoke about this with Brett just yesterday. There's no guilt in doing bicep curls. Like we can just call it bodybuilding. We don't have to call it functional bodybuilding. Call it what it is, and identify that you can enjoy it. You can do bodybuilding. You can do weightlifting. You can do powerlifting. And I think sometimes, and I don't know if you've had this, we're like, we'll have athletes come to us, and they'll say, and this also is just a coach being very clear on what all is involved with the plan and expectations, things like this. But athletes will say, like, is it okay if we do this? And it's like, no, this is your plan, and we're gonna get you to where you need to go. You called the shots, right? It's not that we're going to impose a methodology on you, and I think that's what you're speaking about.
Yeah, it's more of just like letting them make the informed decisions. Like similar, I have an athlete, they're like, oh, could we change the program in this way or jump into this comp? And I'm like, I don't know, can we, like, these are your goals, and like this is the pros and cons of doing it, and these are the trade-offs. And I'm like, you make the call. Because like I always tell athletes this, and I say it kind of tongue-in-cheek, I'm like, I don't really care if you hit your goal. Like what I care is if you are happy. If you don't reach your goal, but you push yourself and you're really happy, like I'm happy. Like if you're trying to squat 450 and you eventually get to 430 and you're psyched and you call it a day, like I'm not going to be bummed because you got what you ultimately wanted out of it, which is the fulfillment. So I think similar with the program, it's like, yeah, for whatever reason, CrossFitters can't do bicep curls, but you call it functional bodybuilding, they're all in it. Like if you tell a CrossFitter to do yoga, they'll laugh at you, but then you tell them to do like mobility WOD or like ROM WOD, and it's like, yeah, that's yoga. So I think it's just kind of understanding, like all training is just training. Like I like that old school idea from like the early 1900s of like being a physical culturist, where it basically just means you work out and just do whatever.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Do you listen to this? Because I know they're obsessed with it as well. It's the Iron Culture podcast with Eric Helms.
So I actually only found out about that like a week or two ago, but I listened to a few episodes and I actually liked it. I listened to the one where it was the dudes from that university that were talking about the history of lifting. It was pretty cool.
Yeah, they're from the University of Texas at Austin. Yeah, there's like a really good physical culture history department there. So yeah, that's pretty interesting. Should we
I think Evan will be respectful of your time. Hey, if ever
you want
to come up, just let us know. We'd love to show you around and lift some weights and have a good time. It's seriously been a great talk. I think that we covered a lot. The energy system super clear. If perhaps in the show notes, if we could get this from you, perhaps more information where people can go learn about perhaps these products. If there's any pertinent
or limitations,
or these products, the limitations, the devices that they can perhaps either measure themselves with or learn more about, or if there are any research articles that you have been inspired by that may have influenced this that we can perhaps attach in the show notes, that would be really helpful. Just so if people can't quite hear it and read it, they might benefit that way. I think that would be wonderful. But from that to the more psychological conversations, I really love this talk.
I could definitely send you guys some references to link in there. And if next time I come to Asheville, maybe sometime in the fall, I could grab coffee and I could get you guys to defend me at Battle Cat from all the hippies.
As long as we're together, it's safe.
Yeah.
Stronger together.
Yeah. All right.
Well, I was gonna laugh because I actually watched one of the YouTube videos the other day, and I saw someone commented like, "Does this guy own any shirts?" Because in a lot of your videos, you're in a tank top, I think.
I've been getting weird comments for like 2 years. It's always like 20 people comment like, "Do you have a tank top sponsorship yet?" I don't know who started this or where this comes from. It is so weird, and I get it on Instagram posts, YouTube videos.
Like,
There's one person with 10 YouTube accounts that just keeps commenting under different account names.
probably one of the other guys at Training Think Tank, probably.
Yeah.
Wait, so people don't like that you just don't wear shirts? You wear sleeveless shirts?
Yeah, dude, it's like 100 degrees in Atlanta. I'm wearing a flannel right now because my house is cold as shit because I have the air conditioning going. But I wear tank tops every day because it's so hot out.
Yeah, we definitely can empathize with that. Being in Asheville, it gets so here.
Oh yeah, awesome. Well, Evan, like we said, we want to be respectful of your time. So thank you so much for hopping on. And again, great talking to you.
Yeah, you got it, man.